I think that the battle that's been taking place at UCT is not a battle between so-called black and white. It's a battle between decency and indecency. And indecency has prevailed. Decent people of all hues have been the victims. And I've heard from people of all hues who've been victims. And then there have been people of all hues who've been perpetrators.
South Africa's universities are in crisis. One institution in particular, the University of Cape Town, is facing a unique combination of destructive forces. These are detailed in a new book by Professor David Benatar. It's called The Fall of the University of Cape Town, Africa's Leading University in Decline. He joins me today on the podcast. David Benatar, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
So David, I'm most of the way through the book. It is quite a tome, over 400 pages. But let's begin with a discussion of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which later mutated into the Fees Must Fall movement. What were some of the origins of this, and what were the events that triggered this wave of protests and ultimately violence that engulfed the University of Cape Town?
Well, I imagine that there was long-standing concern about things like statues on campus and building names. And certainly prior even to the Rhodes Must Fall movement, the university had begun a process of re-examining some of those issues. But the protest in early 2015, where an undergraduate student put excrement on the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, really led to an expedited process for the removal of that statue. And of course, there were a lot of protests around at the time, which I think put pressure on the university in order to remove the statue. And then there was quiet on campus for a while until the Fees Must Fall protests began, not at UCT, but rapidly spread to UCT. And the agenda there was a little different. The agenda there was effectively calling for an end to fees at universities, so free higher education. But although it was called Fees Must Fall, there were a whole range of other demands that came in its wake as well. So there were demands for so-called decolonisation of the curriculum and of the university, and then just an endlessly increasing list of demands, some of them relatively trivial ones.
So David, in terms of the Rhodes Must Fall movement and some of the Fees Must Fall actions as well, you catalogue some of the excesses that characterize this movement. You mentioned the spreading of fecal matter on the Rhodes statue, which was later removed, the statue that is. But also there were a number of incidents of violent harassment, arson, destruction of university property. Could you briefly summarize some of those events?
Yes, so you're correct that excrement was strewn on the statue. I'm not sure whether the protester was thinking about who would have to clean that up afterwards. I doubt that he was planning to do so. But that was relatively mild in the Rhodes Must Fall era. In the Fees Must Fall era, things did get much worse, and there was clearly criminal behavior that took place there. Some of it was the destruction of university property through arson, for example. So there were a number of artworks that were burnt. There were a number of university vehicles that were burnt, including university buses. The Vice Chancellor's office was burnt. There were also many cases of intimidation, where there were threats of violence to people in order to get them to vacate lecture theatres. I'm thinking about staff and students being forced to vacate. And then there were actual instances of assault, where people assaulted other people, protesters assaulted other people. There was an instance in which the Vice Chancellor was punched, another instance in which a student protester invading a law lecture used a sjambok to beat the cell phone out of the hand of another student. And then there were a whole array of other instances of assault that didn't really make it into the media, but which were taking place. And I think that those instances of assault added to the credibility of the threats which constituted the intimidation.
And how did the university authorities react to these actions?
Well, they more or less capitulated. There were sometimes lines drawn and interdicts offered against the students and disciplinary charges laid, but invariably all of these would be withdrawn. And to the best of my knowledge, there were no real repercussions for the students who had protested. None of them actually faced legal consequences or disciplinary consequences within the university. So the university would draw a red line, the students would cross it, and then instead of enforcing the rules, the university would just redraw the red line in a different way, only to have that crossed. And of course, this was entirely predictable, at least for me. And at the time, I did caution that this project of capitulation was only going to generate more and more criminality, which is exactly what it did.
And this is in contrast to the University of the Witwatersrand here in Johannesburg, which was also engulfed by violent protests, but where Vice Chancellor Adam Habib brought in the police and private security to try and quell the protests. And there were some hard lines that were drawn and fairly successfully being able to contain some of these actions.
That's right. Look, those were not pretty pictures to see, but it is true that a much different reaction took place at the University of the Witwatersrand than took place at UCT. There were many people who were opposed to the initial efforts of UCT to bring the police onto campus, and then later UCT brought private security onto campus, and that was also objected to by the protesters and their allies, who spoke repeatedly about the militarization of the campus, and they were opposed to what they called the militarization of the campus. But I think they just had a fundamental misunderstanding about what it means to militarize a campus. Having police enforce the law is not having the military enforce the law. And if you need to have a certain measure of force used in order to enforce the law, that is what law enforcement needs to do. Now, of course, you don't want it disproportionate, and you don't want it to be discriminatory in any way. Insofar as there would be evidence of any of that, then appropriate action would need to be taken against the police services and the private security services. But it can't be the case that people can violate the law with impunity, trample over the rights of others, and not expect the law to be enforced.
Yes, and David, I think what's interesting about the book is that it's essentially a compendium of essays that you wrote mostly on Politics Web at the time. Politics Web is actually the publisher of the book. And so in some ways, it's a chronology of the events as they were unfolding, together with your later reflections after the fact. So I think it's almost unfolds in real time, and you can see that you make certain predictions or you issue cautions that events might spiral further out of control. Then there's often a postscript that says, and that you were vindicated. So just in terms of the kind of culture of acquiescence or capitulation that you highlight in the book, it seems like the university authorities were basically cowed and bullied, but also were somewhat sympathetic to the aims and aspirations of some of the students. And I think particularly around issues around quote unquote decolonizing curricula. We've spoken about the renaming of buildings and so on. But what should the university authorities have done differently, and what were some of the mistakes that were made in your view?
Well, let me say something first. You mentioned the structure of the book. So yes, you're correct that some of the papers are reprints of earlier pieces that I published. And I did wrestle with whether I should do that or whether I should just write afresh. And I think that one of the values of republishing those articles was to give a contemporaneous view of what I was thinking and saying at the time. I think that has a certain force to it, but it is a small portion of the book. The vast majority of the book is new material. What should the university have done? I think that it should have not capitulated to lawlessness. If people have concerns about some feature of the university, there are democratic means for drawing that to the attention and for having discussions about that. And what should take place in the university is that you have an intellectual discussion about who should have statues dedicated to them and who shouldn't, and after whom buildings should be named and after whom they shouldn't be named. That's what a university should do. If you want to enforce your views through criminality, then what you're effectively doing is giving license to other people who have different views from you to engage in criminality in support of their views. And that's not the way in which a society can operate. It's certainly not going to operate well. So there are procedures in a democratic society, and that's true of South Africa at large, and it is true of the University of Cape Town. And I think that those are the sorts of mechanisms that should have been followed. And the university should have stood firm and said, we're happy to have these conversations, but we're not happy to have them while you are burning vehicles, burning artwork, shutting down the campus, preventing people from having the education that they're entitled to.
And one of the terms that's often used is decolonization. And it seems it's quite a nebulous word, and mostly just used as a rallying cry. But if you were to steelman this concept of decolonization, what do you think are some of the normative underpinnings of it? Is it a coherent idea?
Well, this is one of the things that I engage in the book. I ask, what do you mean by decolonization? And what do you mean by transformation? That's another buzzword that's often used. And my very distinct sense is that these words are being used as slogans rather than as well thought through concepts. Now, it's not clear to me that it's my job to steelman the concept. In other words, I don't want to prescribe to people what they ought to be advocating. If they want to advocate for decolonization and for transformation, they need to say something about what they mean by that. What does and doesn't constitute decolonization? I think that the word transformation can have some intelligible meaning, but it's not clear what it is in their minds. I mean, some things in society do need to be transformed. Some things in all societies need to be transformed. They need to be changed from worse to better. But of course, not all change is from worse to better. Some change is from better to worse. And so simply pointing to something being transformative, to it amounting to change, is not to recommend it. Moreover, there are good and bad ways of bringing about change, and not all ways in which change is brought about and has been brought about has been good. So I would want the people advocating these concepts to think more clearly about what it is they're advocating, and then the rest of us can evaluate it. I have been criticized before for not presenting the most coherent and strong conception of decolonization, but it's not obvious to me that that's what my role is. I'm not advocating this position. If somebody else is advocating it, they need to do that hard work. Yeah, because it's not something that obviously reaches out to me as something that we need to do. It's not clear that we really are colonized in any literal sense. Now, of course, there are more figurative senses where people have had their thoughts colonized, let's say, from the outside. But a lot of that is regarded as innocuous. So if you look at how people dress in South Africa, most people are dressing in Western style ways. So there's a sense in which that has been, South Africa has been colonized in that way. If you look at the lingua franca of the society, it's English. That's clearly a colonization of the society. It's not so clear, though, whether we can undo that and whether it would be beneficial to do that. To a certain extent, the past can't be rewritten. It can't be undone. That's not to say that we can't try to do some things to improve the situation. And I do recognize, for example, that if you're being educated in a language that is not your mother tongue, you're at a distinct disadvantage. And I think that trying to get more mother tongue education is a valuable goal. But let's speak about those individual disadvantages that people experience, and let's see what we can do about rectifying them, as opposed to throwing around slogans.
What I find interesting is many students in Afrikaans universities also rallying behind the idea of decolonization and want to abolish Afrikaans in favor of English, which I find a bit of a flawed reasoning. But, you know, I'd like to just unpack this term transformation, because it seems to me that this is just a buzzword for racial representativity, and the call is for race-based selection processes in terms of staff appointments, in terms of student admissions. And you go to some length in the book describing some of the flaws in this way of seeing the world. And I did notice that whenever you refer to a racial group, you use air quotes deliberately so, because you are skeptical about the coherence of these concepts as essentially socially constructed. So let's talk about racial preferences. How have those damaged the functioning of the University of Cape Town?
Well, you drawn a connection between transformation and racial preferences. So the first thing that I should say is that I don't think that transformation is entirely reducible to racial preferences. I do agree with you that racial preferences are a large part of what transformation is taken to be. but it's not all that it's taken to be. So we need to acknowledge that. I think racial preferences are very worrying. Now, let me say I'm aware of the sensitivity around these issues, and it is not easy for me to continually in this society be criticizing something that is so widely accepted. But I think we need to be very clear about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. So I'm not opposed to rectifying injustice. In fact, I'm very much in favor of it. If somebody has been done an injustice, there's a value, an important value to rectify that injustice. I just don't think that we do that through strong racial preferences, because that suggests that everybody of a particular race, and I am using those scare quotes again, that everybody of a particular race is disadvantaged and everybody of another race is not disadvantaged. Those are crude measures that don't reflect reality. So I'm not opposed to real rectification. Let's imagine, for example, there's somebody that's been to an inferior school and their marks are not as high as somebody who's been to a very privileged school. I do think that people who've been to the underprivileged school should have some advantage in the admissions process, because it may well be that what they've achieved is a reflection of as great, if not greater, an ability than the person with the higher grades from the privileged school or the privileged background. So it's not that I'm opposed to affirmative action of that kind. What I'm opposed to is affirmative action on the grounds of race. Because one of the things you're going to have in that kind of policy is you're going to have people who are Black, and I've got scare quotes again. I won't repeat that all the time, but I do use these terms with caution, who's been to a privileged school, who comes from a wealthy family, who's now going to be favored on the basis of their race over, first of all, other Blacks who have actually been disadvantaged, and their marks are going to be lower, so they're going to be less competitive against these students, but also against the occasional so-called white student who does come from a disadvantaged background or has not had the level of schooling that this other person has had. So it's a very blunt measure. Now, I think in South Africa, the racial preferences are particularly worrying, more worrying than they are elsewhere in the world. And there are two reasons for this. First of all is the strength of the racial preference. So racial preferences are much stronger in South Africa than they are in most other, perhaps even all other parts of the world. Now, it's just a matter of mathematics, that the more weight you put on something like a demographic feature, it could be race, it could be sex, it could be any number of other attributes, demographic attributes, the more weight you put on that, the less weight proportionally you're putting on other factors like the ability to do the job. And that's a problem. That's a problem to be admitting people to jobs and to university positions if they're going to be much less able to do the job that they need to do. I want to again say that this is not a racial thing. This is not meant to be an indication or a claim that Blacks are somehow weaker than whites. Insofar as that is true, the most plausible explanation for it in South Africa is going to be the prior disadvantage. And in individual cases, I think that ought to be repaired. But the same point would apply if we were to change these demographics. So we have an underrepresentation of males among nurses, for example, or pre-primary teachers, or even primary school teachers. If you were to put great weight, let's say, on admitting people into nursing degrees and into primary school teaching degrees, if you put a lot of weight on the sex of the person, you're likely to get weaker applicants, because you're not going to be judging people on their suitability to do the job. You're going to be judging them on the basis of the demographic features. So this is a kind of race-neutral, sex-neutral point, that the more weight you put on demographic features, the less weight you're going to be putting on others. So that's the one problem, is the intensity of the preference in South Africa. The other problem is the numbers, the sheer number of people. So in the US, for example, where they have affirmative action policies in some places, they are trying to uplift a minority. They're trying to uplift a smaller proportion of the population. In South Africa, what is being sought is to benefit the majority. And in fact, what is being sought is representativity. So they want the university, let's say professoriate, to look like the demographics of the country. And given the history of the country, given the way in which disadvantage and advantage has followed racial lines in the past, given the amount of time it takes to undo that, and given the appalling job that the ANC government has actually done in trying to undo that historic disadvantage, it's going to be the case that you're going to have large numbers of people who are appointed to positions, let's say, who shouldn't be appointed. Again, I want to hasten to add, not all. There are going to be very many capable Black candidates who are every bit as good, if not better, than the other candidates against whom they're competing. But on aggregate, when you've got the intensity of the preference and you've got and you're trying to favor a majority, you're going to have very serious implications for the society. And I think we're seeing this.
And one of the implications was regarding academic appointments and also to the administration itself. And chapter 18 regarding selecting a dean, racists versus racist xenophobes, I think was quite revealing about some of the problems that this introduces into the kind of day-to-day functioning of a university, where essentially you detail in the chapter how racial demographics were imposed on the selection process. White candidates were effectively excluded despite many of their competencies and good track record of performance in administration. And even there was a fight during the selection process between those who supported appointing a Black South African versus a Black non-South African. So it seems that there's also a kind of a racial nationalist element to this as well, that it's not purely about racial solidarity. Could you shine some light on perhaps some of the problems that have affected the university directly because of this?
Yes, well, let me first emphasize that, yes, there is a xenophobic element to this. So it's not, as you say, just a racial solidarity. It's also a nationalism of some kind. And this is a problem because the best universities in the world, and even just the better universities in the world, are going to want to hire the best people that they can get, irrespective of where they come from. And so one strong feature of good universities is that they are internationalized to a significant degree. They're not going to just appoint locals. They're going to want to appoint the best people, even if they come from abroad. And UCT has been the beneficiary of many international scholars, including from elsewhere in the African continent. And it would be a great pity if we were to lock out talent of that kind, which does seem to be the direction in which UCT is going. In that particular example that you cite, there were these bizarre machinations in which all the focus seemed to be directed on the demographic features about what race somebody was and what nationality they were, and did they become a South African before 1994 or after 1994, and this all just seems entirely irrelevant to somebody's suitability to perform the job of dean. Another thing that should be said is that, of course, this is not just about racial preferences. It's also about ideological conformity. Because if you were to get a darker skinned person, whether from South Africa or abroad, who didn't toe the orthodox line, who had so-called deviant views, that person would be extremely unlikely to be appointed to a position like a deanship at UCT. So it's really an overlay of multiple things, but that ideological element ought not to be dismissed. And in fact, paler people are much more likely to be appointed to these sorts of positions if they do ideologically conform. Their chances are going to diminish to zero if they both have a pale skin and are ideologically deviant.
And I think a very tragic example of what you just mentioned around if you fail to comply or conform with the ideological orthodoxy, just how viciously you can be treated. I think that was very poignantly represented in chapter 19, Manufacturing the Narrative of a Racist University, in which you detail how the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, Bongani Mayosi, how he was treated so abysmally, and he ended up under the stress and the acute anxiety that was caused by his office being invaded, by him being intimidated and threatened on a regular basis, that he ultimately ended up taking his own life. And you included a a comment that was made at the funeral, at the memorial service by his sister, Advocate Mayosi. She said that the vitriolic character of student engagements tore him apart. The abrasive do-or-die, scorched earth approach adopted by students in navigating what was a legitimate cause completely vandalized Bongani's soul. Put simply, this unraveled him. To be clear, Bongani believed in the students' cause, but the personal insults and abuse that were hurled at him without any justification whatsoever, this cut him to the core. This matter of engaging was inimical to everything that Bongani was about. It was offensive to his core values, how he had lived his life up until that point, his vision as a leader. And so he became withdrawn, his personality changed, he spoke less. And I think what was equally sad about that was, he had no previous history of mental illness before his suicide, and seemed to have really flourished at the university as head of the faculty, the Department of Medicine, for example. And I remember when I was at UCT, often seeing him in the Monday paper, looked like a fantastic character and actually a real tribute to transformation. Here's somebody who has, through difficult circumstances, devoted himself to learning and to helping others through medicine. So I think that this was a really telling example of just how tragic some of the consequences of this can be. And I think what was very also quite maddening about what you detail in the chapter is how this was then turned by the Fallists into a kind of a reproach of the university for not being inclusive enough, not being transformed enough, and sort of implying that because the university itself is racist, that he felt excluded and took his own life. So I think that that's a really tragic example of just how far and how dangerous this ideology can be.
I agree. I think that the battle that's been taking place at UCT is not a battle between so-called black and white. It's a battle between decency and indecency. And indecency has prevailed. Decent people of all hues have been the victims. And I've heard from people of all hues who've been victims. And then there have been people of all hues who've been perpetrators. So these are very, very sad features of the university and a conflict that's been taking place.
So, David, another casualty of this new movement that has swept through UCT and acquiescence by the authorities has been the very nature of academic inquiry, free expression, and academic freedom itself. Could you, first of all, explain why is academic freedom important? I'm sure many viewers and listeners intuitively think that it is. But could you explain why it is necessary for the proper functioning of a university and for the free exchange of ideas?
Academic freedom and freedom of expression are not the same thing, but they are overlapping concepts. So one component of academic freedom is the freedom of academics to speak freely, to research freely, to speak about their research freely. But there are other features to academic freedom as well, such as the freedom of the university from inappropriate external forces. Now, these matters are complicated because obviously public universities especially are using public resources, and there has to be a measure of accountability to the state and to the populace for the use of those resources. So I don't want to oversimplify these matters, but what we don't want is we don't want the university's research agenda and the agenda of individual academics being dictated by nefarious forces, by state ideology, for example. It's also the case that I don't think that academic freedom is an absolute value. So, I mean, let's imagine that we lived in a different world. Let's imagine that we lived in a world in which the universities are trying to exclude people of color from the universities. And the state came in and said, you're not allowed to do that. We are going to prohibit you from acting in this discriminatory way. I think that would be an interference with academic freedom that would be entirely appropriate. I don't think that the university would be able to hide behind the academic freedom in order to justify its discriminatory practices. So there are these nuances which I want to be mindful of and attend to, but I don't think that's what we're facing here. What we're facing here is a much more clear-cut scenario where academic freedom is being impinged upon. Let me focus, let's say, on the freedom of individual academics. when you live in a climate where a departure from the orthodox line is going to bring down scorn upon your head, it may impair your ability, let's say, to be appointed if you're still a doctoral student and you're seeking a position, or your ability to get promoted, or just your general well-being in the university, interacting with colleagues, then you're going to be very reticent about speaking out. You're going to rather investigate questions that are not liable to this kind of response. Or if you do investigate the more controversial issues, you're going to be incentivized to reach the kind of conclusions that are going to be sympathetic to those who are wielding the power. So these are dangerous forces that are operative, and we've seen a lot of that at UCT. There's just so much intellectual conformity. Now, it is true that we're seeing a lot of that in other universities in the Anglophone world. This is not a problem that is restricted to UCT, but I have a sense that at UCT it's a lot worse. One of the most ironic cases was the case of the Academic Freedom Lecture. The Academic Freedom Lecture was established at the height of apartheid to honor T.B. Davey, who was a principal of UCT and who was an exponent of academic freedom and who attempted to resist the imposition of apartheid on the higher education sector. He died prematurely and a lecture was established in his name. And throughout the apartheid period, eminent speakers would be brought on an annual basis to give a talk about academic freedom and the importance of it. But it was in 2016, I believe, that the Academic Freedom Committee's choice of speaker, Fleming Rose, was disinvited by the university executive. So we had this really bizarre, absurd scenario in which somebody invited to speak about the importance of academic freedom was now silenced by the university executive. It was perhaps the most ironic and iconic example, but just one of innumerable instances.
And David, may I interject? What was the ostensible reason for his disinvitation?
You said ostensible, which is different from sensible. They gave reasons, and I dissected and evaluated those reasons. That's one of the things that the hearers, the audience here, can read about in the book. They included things like worrying about threat of violence. But when we pressed the university executive on whether they had any credible threats of such violence, they said they didn't. So it was a highly speculative reference to a threat. And they said it would bring dissent to campus, and as though we hadn't already had dissent. But the interesting thing is that introducing views that are hostile to the intolerant minority, those are the ones that the university is interested in silencing, whereas views that are hostile to tolerant minorities, those are ones that the university is quite happy to indulge. My own view is that we should be tolerating all the views. We should have a rich array of views. Nobody's offense should be a bar to anybody else speaking. But I do believe at universities and elsewhere, the nature of that exchange should be a rational one and a reasoned one and a civil one. I'm in favor of all of those attributes. So I think everybody should be exposed to ideas they disagree with. It's good for them and it's good for everybody else.
And what about freedom of expression? I mean, you've spoken about this ideological conformity. Why is free expression so important, particularly in an academic context? And how is it being narrowed in your view?
There's so many reasons why freedom of expression is important, but one can't really speak about this without referring back to John Stuart Mill, who envisages a range of possibilities when it comes to the view that you're wanting to silence or that somebody is wanting to silence. And he says, if the view you're trying to silence happens to be the right view, well, then you're going to be foregoing the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. He steps through a variety of other possible scenarios, but he says, imagine even that the view you're wanting to suppress is false. He says there's a value even in hearing false views, because when the truth rubs up against false views, you can actually renew your conviction in the truth because you know it's been tested against alternative views. So instead of it being a kind of dead dogma, as he calls it, it becomes a living truth. I'm summarizing here. We don't have time to investigate these things in full detail, but there are really superb reasons for tolerating and allowing to be expressed views that somebody may take to be false.
But in many ways, a lot of the language of the fallists is around protecting themselves or demanding protection from speech that is, in their view, harmful or causes offense. But you don't have a right to not be offended.
This is where we find ourselves in Alice in Wonderland, with Alice in Wonderland, because it now becomes the case that hearing views you don't like, or even having them expressed on campus without you listening to them, is now violence. But you're attacking people and burning things and shoving people and silencing people is not violence. So we've got a kind of inversion of the meanings of words. And I don't know whether to attribute that to confusion. I suppose that would be the charitable interpretation, but there are certainly less charitable interpretations as well of what's going on when people play those games, when they do those things, when they invert those meanings.
So, David, I'd like to talk about the future of the university and also of the humanities in particular. And for me, attending the University of Cape Town was a life-changing experience. It exposed me to all sorts of ideas that I hadn't encountered before, many of them which made me very uncomfortable and which challenged my preconceived view of the world. So what is the role of the humanities? You're a philosopher as well. Do you think that philosophy and generally the arts have a sustainable future, particularly in this context? Because it seems to me to be an almost unbearable state of affairs.
Well, the philosophy department at UCT, at least, has resisted these pressures for quite some years. I'm not sure how much longer that will last. And I'm beginning already to see some cracks in the structure. But I think you could still hear a range of views in the philosophy department at UCT. I'm not convinced about a range of other humanities courses at UCT. I'm certainly hearing reports from students who are complaining about a kind of monolithic view that is presented. There being quite crude examples where the ideological preconceptions of the lecturer are required. You have to just trot those out in your exam if you want to do well. In fact, one example I give in the book is of a lecturer who asked his students in an exam question to write detailed notes on race and racism, and said, in the process, please be sure to explain why blacks and whites can't be friends. So this is not even a statement which is now inviting the students to discuss. It's giving you the line you have to take and which you have to then justify in your exam question. Now, this is, I suppose, a worse example. I'm not saying all exam questions in the humanities are taking that characteristic, but these are very worrying developments, and certainly there are high degrees of intellectual conformity that are being required.
Yeah, and David, I certainly remember Philosophy 101, where in a class of about 300 or so students, you would, by the end of the semester, have memorized everyone's name. We're engaging in a climate of openness. No idea was sacred. Everything was open to interrogation. And it saddens me greatly to hear that you're no longer lecturing that first year philosophy course.
That's correct.
I think it speaks to the toxic environment that has enveloped the university. So I'm glad to hear that you're still lecturing to postgraduate students, but I think it is a real loss to the humanities community of scholars and students that you're no longer part of the undergraduate curriculum.
Well, I'm teaching more senior students in the undergraduate curriculum. There's only a certain degree of latitude that I have, but I'm not teaching those very large first year classes.
I also have noticed recently in South Africa and then also abroad, as you said, this is not exclusive to UCT. It might be a very extreme example of some of the problems that are manifesting in universities around the world. But we've also seen, for example, in Evergreen College in the United States, Brett Weinstein was effectively, chased out of that university for objecting to some kind of symbolic racial gesture. We've seen many campuses This is detailed a lot in The Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, as well as in Helen Pluckrose's book, Cynical Theories. So, you know, it seems that a lot of people are basically seeing that these very high student costs emerging with tens of thousands of dollars worth of debt, the kind of preponderance of administrators and bureaucrats who are kind of kowtowing to these extreme students. It seems that many people are becoming disaffected with the university system and are basically setting up private colleges. I'm thinking of Soltech, for example, in South Africa. There's the University of Austin, which Peter Boghossian is involved with, amongst others. So do you think that we're going to see a move away from these kind of big, bloated, mostly public sector universities, publicly funded universities, towards more kind of niche private colleges where a culture of academic freedom and free inquiry can flourish?
I don't know whether I have the requisite expertise to comment on that. I must say I'm more pessimistic about the prospect of that happening in South Africa than I am of it happening in somewhere like the United States. And that's in part because I think the problems that we're seeing within the universities here are reflected in national problems and also a reflection of national problems. I also think that we've got a high degree of centralization here, and any new university which was established would, of course, have to comply with national legislation, including appointments legislation. And I just am not optimistic that we're going to get a solution via that kind of mechanism. But perhaps they're more imaginative and entrepreneurial people than me. In fact, I'm sure they're more imaginative and entrepreneurial people than me who could find a way. I'm just not holding out hope for that.
Okay, well, look, I think these things probably take some time to change, and there's a long runway. But certainly the current situation that you describe in the book is unsustainable in my view.
Yes, I suppose it depends on what you want to sustain. If you just want to sustain the madness, you could sustain it, I'm sure, for quite a long time. If we look historically, mad ideas have had quite a long shelf life. It takes a long time for people to realize, actually, we should abandon this. It's not working. And then the problem is humans will just make that same mistake again and again. And one of the senses I have here in South Africa is a strong sense of déjà vu, that we're not learning from the mistakes that humans have made elsewhere and in prior times. And that's just immensely frustrating. I would have hoped that the universities would be the one place where people were most likely to recognize those problems and avoid repeating them. But it seems that for all the investigation that universities do of the surrounding environment, they're not very good at examining themselves.
Yeah, and groupthink is a significant part of the human condition, I think. And it's very difficult when you face this kind of wall of opposing opinion to go against that. And I think you've been very brave in speaking your mind and being true to your convictions.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, David, if you were to be advising a young person just emerging out of high school who's curious about the world, who's concerned with some of the developments that we've spoken about today, and who is interested in thinking critically and engaging with the world and hopefully making the world a slightly better place, someone perhaps who's interested in philosophy, in leading a moral life or creating a more just world, what would you say to them? Would you encourage them to pursue philosophy as a discipline, or would you maybe advise them to do something else with their energy?
I think it really does depend on the person. I don't think everybody should be studying philosophy, but I think it is important that some people do so. And then I suppose my question is, are you asking about a South African or somebody anywhere in the world?
Let's, for the sake of discussion, talk about South Africa, which is where we are.
Well, again, I think it's good if some people study philosophy. I just hope that they're going to get the kind of education that they should in these areas. It will depend in part on what university you go to. So you should look quite carefully to go to one where you can still hear a diversity of views and be held to appropriate academic standards, because that's another problem that we see is sort of declining standards in many places. And then if you could study abroad, then that may be a better option, but that's often prohibitively expensive for South Africans. And if you do find yourself in a university where you're just meeting an ideological wall, then self-study, read widely, inquire, even if you're not being taught to inquire by others.
Yeah, and I also think the internet is a fantastic tool for connecting with like-minded people around the world. Maybe it's a poor proxy for the richness of an in-person engagement, but if you're hungry enough for those ideas, then you can find them.
Yes, I think the internet has certain advantages, but also has certain disadvantages. And one of the things I do worry about are the echo chambers that people find themselves in. So I would strongly recommend speaking to people who disagree with one. And it's not always going to be via social media. In fact, I think it'll almost never be via social media. You need to seek out intelligent interlocutors with opposing views to you, as opposed to just anybody with an opposing view to you. That's where the real value, I think, lies.
And how would you advise academics or students who are facing similar circumstances to you to go about pushing back against some of these dangerous ideas without incurring significant risks that may destroy their career or harm them in other ways? What do you think are some of the strategies that can be employed to perhaps raise doubts or to firmly and in a principled way push back against some of these ideas?
Again, a very hard question. My sense at UCT and perhaps more broadly in South Africa is that this battle may have been lost. I don't know whether one can actually bring about the requisite change at UCT. But there are things that people can do. I mean, one is at least to try to ferret out others who share your views. Although there's value in speaking to people who disagree with you, sometimes there's a value in speaking to people who do agree with you and comparing notes with them, gaining a measure of support so that you don't feel entirely alone. There are also some developments internationally. There's a new journal called the Journal of Controversial Ideas. And one of the options that it provides is the opportunity to publish anonymously or pseudonymously. So you don't publish under your actual name, so that you can express an idea without suffering the consequences of doing so. So there are some options available, but if you want to bring about change, you typically have to engage at the rock face, and that's where you're going to get the negative consequences.
Well, Professor David Benatar, I wanted to thank you very much for coming on to the show, and I highly recommend the book. We've left details in the description where you can purchase it. It is available through Amazon and also in selected bookstores in South Africa. It is called The Fall of the University of Cape Town. I highly recommend that anybody who is concerned about the state of our universities to give it a read. It is not exactly the feel-good hit of the summer, I will add, but I think it's a very important read and something that all South Africans should be wrestling with. But David Benatar, thank you very much for joining me on Solutions with David Ansara.
And thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well and also leave a review. That helps the show to grow. My name is David Ansara. Until next week, take care.